In ancient Judah, the crops vanished. An insect plague stripped the fields bare, dried up the water supplies, and collapsed the local economy. If we look at this through a modern lens, we see an environmental disaster resulting in severe famine. But the book of Joel opens with a completely different framework. The prophet is delivering a reeb, a formal, divine covenant lawsuit brought by Yahweh against his people. Look at this text in verse 2. Joel uses two specific Hebrew imperatives, shimu, meaning hear, and ha'azinu, meaning give ear. In ancient Israel, this is standard legal language used to summon witnesses into a heavenly courtroom. The devastation on the ground is the enforcement of a legal verdict. Yahweh is using an insect army to execute a legal sanction that systematically decreates the land and forces the cosmic liturgy of the temple to collapse. For Joel, natural observation is not enough. Disaster must be interpreted through divine revelation and covenant law. This legal sanction is carried out in 4 successive waves of destruction described in verse 4. Joel uses 4 distinct Hebrew terms for the locusts: gazam, arbe, yelik, and hasil. Whether these are different species or stages of life, the repetition functions as a rhetorical device. It signals absolute, inescapable destruction. What one wave leaves, the next consumes. The second term, arbe, carries profound historical irony. It is the exact same Hebrew word used to describe the 8th plague inflicted upon Egypt in Exodus chapter 10. In verse 6, the language shifts entirely. Joel categorizes these insects as a goy, a nation, equipped with lion's teeth. This activates the theology of the divine warrior. The locusts are personified as an organized military. This invasion has strict legal precedent. It operates exactly within the bounds of the covenant curses outlined in Deuteronomy 28, where foreign invasion and agricultural collapse are promised for covenant rebellion. The people redeemed from Egypt are now experiencing an Egyptian judgment upon their own sacred geography. Nature is not acting autonomously here. Creation itself has been weaponized by the Creator to enforce covenant discipline upon his tenants. To understand the severity of this judgment, we have to look at how the physical land responds to the invading army through a concept called anthropocosmic resonance. Anthropocosmic resonance is the biblical principle where human covenant failure causes the physical creation to unravel. The state of the soil mirrors the spiritual state of the people. In verses 7 through 12, Joel specifically lists the targets of the locusts: the vine, the fig tree, the pomegranate, the palm, and the apple tree. Look closely at this diagram comparing Genesis to Joel. On the left, we see the events of Genesis 1, day 3, where God commands the earth to bring forth vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and fruit trees. On the right, we have Joel's list of destroyed fields, vines, and fruit trees. Joel is methodically reversing day 3 of creation. He is systematically returning the ordered, Edenic archetype back toward chaotic wilderness. The link between humanity and the ground is explicit in verse 10. The text says the Adamah, the soil itself, mourns. This takes us straight back to Genesis, linking Adam, humanity, directly to the suffering ground. This culminates in an existential crisis in verse 12. Because the trees have withered, human joy, the Hebrew word sashon, is personified as withering away from the sons of men. The locust plague is an act of anthropogenic decreation. The environmental collapse is the visible, physical symptom of a fractured covenant relationship. The devastation does not stop at the agricultural fields. It moves inward to the architectural center of Israel's cosmos, the Jerusalem temple. This animated model maps the theological relationship between the agrarian land and the temple. The sanctuary serves as the axis mundi, the center of the world, and it depends on continuous supply lines of grain, wine, and oil from the surrounding environment. The daily mincha, or grain offering, and the nesek, the drink offering, rely entirely on this agricultural supply to maintain visible covenant communion with Yahweh. As the locusts strip the fields, those supply lines are severed. Verse 9 announces the inevitable result: the offerings cease entirely. The temple effectively powers down. The Hebrew text employs a dark irony here. It says the offerings are cut off, the word nekrat. That is the exact same root word used for cutting a covenant. The offerings meant to maintain the covenant have been severed by the breach of that very covenant. This triggers a massive liturgical crisis. The priests, unable to mediate the sacrifices, strip off their garments of glory. Joel commands them to lie all night in rough sackcloth. The temple is not isolated from creation. Creation exists to become worship. When the land is decreated, the cosmic liturgy simply halts. With the liturgy broken and the land dead, Joel introduces the required solution in verse 14, the sacred assembly. Notice what Joel does not prescribe. He doesn't call for an emergency economic reform, agricultural innovation, or a military defense strategy against the locusts. Instead, he commands the people to consecrate a fast, kadeshu som. Removing food entirely redirects the nation's dependence away from the cursed ground and directly back to Yahweh. This network diagram illustrates a principle of corporate ontology. The entire community, elders, priests, and inhabitants, must gather together. They do not repent as scattered individuals, but fuse into a single covenant body at the temple. There is a profound theological mercy hidden in this text. The temple is stripped of its physical offerings, yet its doors remain open for intercession. God still invites them into his presence. True liturgical pedagogy teaches that the solution to covenant judgment is not better religious performance. The solution is corporate brokenness and relational restoration. This brings us to the climactic theological pivot of the chapter in verse 15, with the prophet's cry, "Alas for the day." Joel is invoking the Yom Yahweh, the day of the Lord. In biblical theology, this is not a 24-hour period. It is a decisive, appointed time of divine intervention and judgment. Joel uses the current locust plague as a fractal. The localized historical disaster serves as a prophetic preview of the ultimate eschatological judgment at the end of time. He calls it destruction from the Almighty, the Hebrew shod from Shaddai. It reveals God's terrifying, sovereign control over history and nature. Chapter 1 follows a clear teleological progression. It starts with an agricultural catastrophe, escalates into a covenant lawsuit, triggers a literal decreation of the land, and pushes the horizon all the way to eschatological judgment. Joel 1 demands that we interpret reality through divine revelation. It forces us to recognize the hand of the divine warrior and return to the covenant before the final day arrives.